We will begin today with Dr. Sasha Stump providing a brief overview of the Safer Products for Washington program and our criteria for safer, feasible, and available. Sasha's overview will be followed by a presentation on alternative work for jewelry and accessories, motor vehicle tires, and cookware and kitchen supplies. After all three presentations, we will stop the recording and take a 5-minute break. When we return from break, we'll answer questions from the Q&A. Then we'll take any verbal questions from folks in attendance. When we're sharing information, we ask that you stay muted so everyone can hear. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Sasha.
Thank you, Wayne. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm turning my camera on briefly again so that you can put a face to the name, but I'm going to turn it off while I present to save bandwidth and ensure my voice comes through clearly. My name's Sasha Stump, and I'm going to start our webinar today by sharing a short introduction on Safer Products for Washington. Safer Products for Washington is a program that was established in 2019 to implement Chapter 70A.350 RCW. The goals of the program are to equitably reduce exposure to toxic chemicals from consumer products and prevent their releases to the environment. Restrictions and reporting requirements that are implemented by the program are adopted in rule under Chapter 173337. We implement the Safer Products for Washington program on a repeating 5-year cycle. It's divided into 4 phases that you see on the slide. In phase 1, we identify priority chemicals and classes of chemicals to focus on. In phase 2, we identify priority products that are significant sources or uses of priority chemicals. Then in phase 3, we determine regulatory actions for those priority product and chemical combinations. And this is where we're at in our current cycle. Then finally, in phase 4, we'll work to adopt the regulatory actions from phase 3 into rule. Once we complete phase 4, we then go back to phase 1, and this 5-year cycle repeats. We're currently in our second cycle of implementation for our program, and you can see the dates that we expect to complete each phase of this cycle on the slide. And as I said, we're currently in phase 3 of this implementation process, and so we're working to determine what regulatory action we'll take for chemicals and products that we identified in phases 1 and 2. If you'd like to review our full rationale for why we listed the priority chemical classes or the products that we'll talk about today, I encourage you to refer to our Cycle 2 Phase 1 and Phase 2 reports. Links to these reports will be shared in chat. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we're currently in phase 3 of our process where we make regulatory determinations for the product chemical combinations we prioritize this cycle. When we're making regulatory determinations for these priority chemicals and products, the department has 3 options to choose from. Our first option is we can restrict the use of a priority chemical in a priority product. Our second option is a reporting requirement where manufacturers would have to report to Ecology when they use a priority chemical in the priority product. And then our third option is we could choose to take no action. If we propose a restriction, we must show that safer alternatives to priority chemicals are feasible and available, and that the restriction would either reduce a significant source or use of priority chemicals, or the restrictions necessary to protect the health of a sensitive population or species. And you might ask yourself, how do we determine what's safer? Well, safer is defined in our statute as less hazardous to humans or the environment. With that in mind, we developed a framework called our criteria for safer to evaluate and compare the hazards of chemicals. Some of the hazards we consider are listed here on the slide, and they include things like associations with cancer, developmental toxicity, aquatic toxicity, or persistence in the environment. When we're looking for alternatives, we're looking for chemicals that are safer than the hazardous chemicals that we've prioritized for work in the program. And we think of safer as a spectrum. And so in our criteria for safer framework, we set hazard tiers along that spectrum to indicate significant steps towards use of less hazardous chemicals. We call these tiers our minimum and our additional criteria. These tiers align with scoring and other hazard assessment methodologies, and this lets us leverage these other assessments to inform our work. For example, chemicals that are evaluated using the green screen methodology that scores a benchmark 2 meet our minimum criteria for safer, whereas benchmark 3 chemicals meet our additional criteria. In addition to green screen, We also refer to other hazard assessments, such as those developed by Cyvera and ChemForward, as well as other resources like the EPA's Safer Chemicals Ingredients List, or SKIL. For more information and details on our criteria for safer framework, please refer to the documentation that we'll also share in chat. In addition to identifying safer chemical alternatives, we also look to see if we can identify safer material or process alternatives. This is because our statute also defines safer to include a change in materials or design that eliminates the need for a chemical alternative. Although this won't work for all chemicals or products we look at, these types of substitutions can be some of the more preferable ways to reduce the use of hazardous chemicals. An example from our past work in the program is us highlighting digital receipts as an alternative to the use of bisphenols or other chemical developers in thermal paper receipts. Another example is using washable fabrics for certain applications rather than coating fabrics with something like PFAS to add stain resistance. These alternative processes or materials can work in some applications, and so they offer alternative options to consider in addition to reformulating products to use safer chemicals. I also wanted to briefly mention what we mean when we say feasible and available. We define these by referring to the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse Alternative Assessment Guide. Feasible means that the alternative is either used or marketed for the application of interest or another similar application. Available means the alternative is currently used for the application of interest or is sold for use in that application at a price that's close to current. Now, in practice, what this means is we first look for products on the market that already use the safer alternatives we've identified, because that's really good evidence that they're feasible and available for use in that product type. A few last notes before we move into our presentations on specific products. First, it's important to be clear that while you may see products, trade names, or organizations listed on the slides that you'll see today, these do not imply endorsement by Ecology. We often refer to existing trade names or products in the market to demonstrate feasibility and availability for alternatives, but these are meant as examples only. Second, the information on alternatives and potential regulatory actions that we share today should be thought of as a snapshot in time and not as our final work product. We're still actively working to identify alternatives and determine if they're safer, feasible, and available, and some of our product categories are further along than others. What that also means is that we still have time to incorporate input and feedback, and so we encourage folks in attendance to share information that can inform our continued work. Okay, so that's the end of my short introduction. So now we'll transition into presentations from our Safer Products technical team on 3 product categories that they lead as part of our work in Cycle 2. The products we'll have presentations on today are jewelry and accessories, motor vehicle tires, and cookware and kitchen supplies. These presentations will be recorded and they'll be made available on our YouTube channel, so we do encourage you to go back and refer to them as needed after the webinar. At the end of these presentations, we'll also have time to hear feedback and answer questions about our process. And with that, I'll pass to our first presenter, Yvonne.
Thank you, Sasha. Good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. My name is Ivan Titale, and I'm a Safer Products Chemist in the Hazardous Waste and Toxic Reduction Program at the Washington State Department of Ecology. I'm excited to share our updates on the priority product of jewelry and accessories. I will now turn my camera off and begin my presentation. Next slide, please. The priority chemical classes for jewelry and accessories were lead and lead compounds, as well as cadmium and cadmium compounds. I will refer to them as lead and cadmium compounds from now on. As previously laid out in Cycle 2 Implementation Phase 1 report of Safer Products for Washington, key hazards of lead and cadmium compounds included carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, developmental toxicity, neurotoxicity, and ecological toxicity. Next slide, please. We defined the scope for jewelry and accessories in Cycle 2 Implementation Phase 2 report of Safer Products for Washington to include articles and accessories intended to be worn by a person, as well as kits to make jewelry and accessories sold to consumers. Some example products included beads, rings, earrings, and piercing jewelry. Next slide, please. As the first step in our alternative analysis, we define the chemical functions of lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories. To obtain this information, we relied on two resources. The first one was a web page from California Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC, entitled Lead in Jewelry. The second one was a web page from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or MPCA, entitled Protecting Children and Families from Lead and Cadmium. Next slide, please. Based on the two sources mentioned in the previous slide, we determine the following functions for lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories: as a pigment, as a plastic stabilizer, namely for polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, and to make jewelry and or accessories, or articles for short, heavier. These functions were then defined using the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, CONTACT's functional use categories. These definitions were based on an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, document on harmonization of functional use categories and US EPA's own added categories. The links to these resources are provided in the chat. Next slide, please. In addition to the two sources that were previously mentioned, we use the following resources when we perform alternative analysis for lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories. Special Chem and Note were used to find alternative chemicals with the same or similar functions as that of lead and cadmium compounds. We also use these websites for feasibility and availability analysis, specifically to determine the trade names of potential chemical alternatives for the functions of pigment and plastic stabilizer. DTSC's metal-containing jewelry law fact sheet and a previous alternative analysis for lead performed by Germany's Federal Institute for Occupational Safety and Health were also used, as both resources listed different chemicals or materials that could replace lead in jewelry and accessories. And finally, web searches were performed to determine the feasibility and availability of chemical alternatives for the function of to make articles heavier. Next slide, please. This slide contains the list of safer alternative chemicals that we have determined to meet ecology's minimum or additional criteria for safer. Chemical names, their chemical abstract surface registry numbers, or CASRNs, tier, mat, and functions are listed as the headers for each of the columns. Next slide. The 5 chemical alternatives that met our minimum criteria for safer were ceramic materials and wares chemicals, calcium carbonate, magnesium oxide, zirconium oxide, and titanium non-nano. Next slide. The 3 chemical alternatives that met our additional criteria for safer were magnesium carbonate, calcium stearate, and epoxidized soybean oil. Next slide, please. Next, we take a look at which chemical alternatives provide which functions. 4 chemical alternatives, namely ceramic materials and wares chemicals, calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, and zirconium oxide, can provide pigment function. Next slide, please. 3 chemical alternatives, namely calcium stearate, epoxidized soybean oil, and magnesium oxide, can provide plastic stabilizer function. Next slide, please. And then 3 chemical alternatives, namely calcium carbonate, which is the chemical name for pearl or aragonite, zirconium oxide, which is the chemical name for cubic zirconia or CZ, and titanium non-nano, can provide the quote-unquote to make articles heavier function. Next slide, please. In terms of feasibility and availability, this table lists the alternative chemicals and examples of chemical trade names available in the marketplace or jewelry making materials sold to the public. While I will not go through every chemical line by line, audience can always go back to the recording of this presentation and hit pause at this time to examine this list closely. Next slide, please. We considered metal alloys, and in the context of jewelry and accessories, specifically stainless steel, as a possible safer material alternative. This determination was based on a 2010 review by the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health on the toxicity of steel, as found in Santon and T et al. Examples of specific grades of stainless steel used in jewelry and accessories are the 304 or 316L. We also considered other materials for making jewelry and accessories listed under DTSC's Metal-Containing Jewelry Law Fact Sheet webpage as safer material alternatives, such as all natural decorative material, including amber, bone, coral, feathers, fur, horn, leather, shell, or wood that is in its natural state and is not treated in a way that adds lead, as well as elastic, fabric, ribbon, rope, or string that does not contain intentionally added lead. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, possible safer process alternatives for the function of, quote unquote, to make articles heavier may include the use of lead-free solder or soldering paste flux, lead-free solder alloys, and or lead-free core wire while working in an area close to where air exits in the studio, as well as the use of graphite as solid lubricant. In addition, possible safer process alternative for the function of pigment could also include anodic oxidation of titanium, or nano, as this electrochemical reaction is known to provide iridescent colors. Next slide, please. In summary, we believe that we have identified safer alternatives to lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories that met ecology's minimum or additional criteria for safer. We believe that safer alternatives are feasible and available for all functions served by lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories. Therefore, current information that we have collected supports a restriction on the use of lead and cadmium compounds in jewelry and accessories. Next slide, please. Having said that, we still welcome feedback from interested parties. Some of our current questions for this priority product include, are there resources where we can find material composition for jewelry? Examples based on other priority products included material safety data sheets, or MSDSs, or ingredients disclosure requirements. Another question, are there safer chemicals or materials we should consider for the function of, quote unquote, to make article heavier? We note that niobium is currently under our consideration, but we are not ready yet to determine if it meets our minimum criteria for safer or not. You can send your feedback to the listed email address. This ends my presentation, and I thank you for your attention. Please allow me to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Craig Manhan.
Thanks, Yvonne. Hi, my name is Craig Manahan, and I'm a toxicologist at Ecology, and I'll be giving an update on our work around motor vehicle tires. Next slide, please. The priority chemical for motor vehicle tires is the chemical 6-PPD. For this product, the priority chemical is just one chemical, not a class of chemicals like in other products. Hazards of this chemical and its transformation products include skin sensitization, reproductive toxicity, and aquatic toxicity. 6-PPD quinone is a transformation product of 6-PPD, and it is highly toxic to aquatic organisms. Next slide, please. As I said, 6-PPD quinone is extremely toxic to several salmonids, most noticeably coho salmon, where the LC50 has been found to be as low as 40 nanograms per liter. This is so low that if you were to put a few grains of rice worth of the chemical into an Olympic-sized swimming pool, it would kill half of the coho in the pool. It's thought that 6-ppd quinone has a large impact on pre-spawn mortality, in which coho die before spawning in affected streams. Next slide. Motor vehicle tires were assigned as a priority product by the legislature, and they define the product as new or replacement tires for a motorized vehicle intended for on-highway or off-highway use. So that would include car tires, truck tires, or motorcycle tires. Next slide. 6-ppd was chosen by the legislature as a priority product in part because it can transform into 6-ppd quinone upon exposure to ozone. 6-ppd is an antidegradant and anti-ozonant in tires, which means that it protects the tire against damage by ozone in the air, prolonging the life of the tire. It is part of this black section here in the tire component figure. Anti-ozonants are vital to the safety of the tire. You can see here in some of the testing we contracted that after 24 hours of ozone exposure, unaltered strips of tire rubber snap in half. However, addition of an anti-ozonant like 6-ppd can keep the rubber strong for much longer, preventing breakage. Every tire on the road now uses 6-ppd, and since it is vital for the safety of the tire, an alternative really needs a lot of testing. Next slide. So what are some of the potential alternatives to 6-ppd? PPDs and PDs are the most obvious candidates for replacement since they are most similar to 6-ppd. Phenyl-p-phenylenediamines, or PPDs, like 6-ppd, have the phenyldiamine, the ring with nitrogens, and a phenyl group, or another ring, on one side, but they just have a different side chain compared to 6-ppd. 6-ppd has a 6-carbon chain, and some PPDs that have been proposed as alternatives are isopropyl PPD, or IPPD, with a 3-carbon chain, and 7-ppd, which has a 7-carbon chain. Para-substituted phenylenediamines, or PDs, which replace the phenyl group with a duplicate carbon chain, have also been proposed. These include 7,7-PD, which has 2 7-carbon chains, and CCPD, which has 2 cyclohexyl chains. The performance of these similar compounds does indeed seem to match pretty closely to 6-ppd in our testing, but their similar structure also means that they likely have similar toxicity to 6-ppd, and they can form quinones that might be similar to 6-ppd quinone. We have not found any chemical quite as toxic as 6-ppdq, but it appears that other PPDs particularly, such as IPPDQ and 7-ppdq, are also quite toxic to coho. In addition to PPDs and PDs, there have been a slew of other chemicals proposed by researchers and companies, with some of them listed here, and including some new chemicals that we don't really know anything about. A lot of what we at Ecology have been doing is trying to evaluate these alternatives, both the performance in rubber as an anti-ozonant and the toxicity, since we don't want to replace 6-ppd with something that is just as bad. Next slide. So where are we in our evaluation of alternatives? Well, tire companies can use any existing chemical if they meet their performance standards, such as the other PPDs and PDs that I just mentioned. And there are several chemical companies that have developed new alternatives to 6-ppd, which they are promoting for tire manufacturers to use, with some listed here. And there are others that we barely know anything about that could be out there. Some of these, such as SA6000 and the amine functionalized graphene, we know are undergoing road testing in China and India, but no tires made with these chemicals are yet for sale that we know of. But these are chemical companies, not tire companies. It is tire companies that need to make the call on whether a chemical meets their performance requirements, which means a lot of road testing to ensure safety. In addition, tire companies are the ones that will have to revamp their tire manufacturing process to use an alternative, and changing the anti-ozonant has the potential to disrupt this process. Next slide. How safe does an alternative need to be for us to say that it is safe enough to use? We have our own safer criteria for safer products for Washington, but we're also conducting a separate alternatives assessment that we will use to inform this safer products conclusions. And we have additional criteria for that alternatives assessment. If we just look at coho toxicity, the LC50, or concentration that kills half of the exposed organisms, for 6-ppd quinone is 0.040 micrograms per liter, or 40 nanograms per liter. But the LC50 for the 6-ppd parent compound is only about 500 micrograms per liter. And environmental detections of these compounds are almost all less than around 3 micrograms per liter, with peaks lasting for less than 24 hours. So in theory, if we had a chemical whose LC50 was around 50 to 100 micrograms per liter for the parent compound and all transformation products, if it was used similarly to 6-ppd in tires, and it behaves similarly to 6-ppd and 6-ppd quinone in the environment, we should have similar levels, and we would probably never get close to those LC50 values in the streams, and it wouldn't be killing fish. However, we're never really going to know how a chemical is going to behave in the environment until it is widely in use. And given that 6-ppd replacement will be present in enormous quantities all over the world, as big a margin of error as possible with these values is a standard approach. Unfortunately, antioxidants are meant to react with things, which often leads to some sort of aquatic toxicity. In addition to coho toxicity, we also have to worry about toxicity to other aquatic species. We know that because of its use case, this chemical will be getting into waterways, and it isn't just coho salmon that live there. But how many species do we need to screen before saying an alternative is safer? We can't test it on everything. That would take too long and be too expensive. And it isn't just aquatic toxicity that we have to worry about. Tires are handled by a bunch of people, from manufacturing to sale to use, and driving can create road dust and particle emissions. Research has already shown levels of 6-ppd and 6-ppd quinone in human blood. And 6-ppd has been shown to be a reproductive toxicant, and we want to take this opportunity to replace it with something that is not as harmful to humans. That is why we also have human health criteria for the alternatives that we'll have to meet. And lastly, we don't just have to worry about the chemical that is replacing 6-ppd. We know that these chemicals will react with ozone and oxygen to make new compounds. After all, that's what 6-ppd quinone is. So how do we ensure that all of these transformation products are also not going to be hazardous to people and the environment? We've published our own hazard criteria that addresses these points on how we are going to evaluate alternatives, which include the details of aquatic toxicity, human health, and environmental toxicity standards that we'll look for in alternatives, and how we are going to evaluate both the parent compound and transformation products. This is specific to the alternatives assessment, but since our safer products assessment will build on that alternatives assessment, it is likely that we'll use similar standards. Next slide. So as mentioned, for our Safer Products for Washington program, we need an alternative to be safer, feasible, and available in order for us to institute a restriction. How we've traditionally handled this is that an alternative has to be in use in the product and serving the same role as the chemical it is replacing, and that product has to be sold on the market. This means that a tire manufacturer has to make a 6-ppd free tire, we have to know what chemical is replacing 6-ppd, and we have to be able to say that that chemical meets our standard for safer before we can use Safer Products for Washington to restrict it. Tire manufacturers say that they need several years of testing before they will feel comfortable that it will be safe for the life of the tire. Given where companies say they are in the development cycle, we're unlikely to have a feasible and available alternative identified in time for this cycle of safer products. Though you never know if a manufacturer is going to come around and try and be the first to market a 6-ppd free tire. Next slide. We've examined the literature and contracted out some of our own testing in an effort to determine what chemicals may be safer, feasible, and available if a tire is produced with them. For the toxicity criteria here, I'm referencing the expanded aquatic toxicity criteria I mentioned earlier, as well as human health criteria. For rubber performance, there isn't really a standardized method for determining if a chemical will work in tires as an effective antioxidant. We've heard from manufacturers that dynamic ozone resistance, or resistance to ozone while the rubber is being stretched and de-stretched repeatedly, is the hardest function of 6-ppd to replace. So that is what we tested with this ASTM D1149 method. However, we're not really sure what level of performance in this test is sufficient to replace 6-ppd, but we made a guess based on how rubber with no antioxidant performed. In addition, there are many other factors besides just this one rubber test to determine if an alternative will work in a tire. It has to work well with the manufacturing process, it has to last for the life of the tire, It can't impede the performance of other ingredients. And it also might be possible that modifications of the formula could mean that one alternative that we discounted here would actually work under certain recipes. Ultimately, as I said on the last slide, if a tire is made with an alternative, passes all the required road safety tests, and is for sale, that's the ultimate proof that it will work. So what we have here is just our best guess given what we know now. With all that said, here's what we're thinking as of this moment. We're discounting 7-PPD and IPPD because they do not meet our hazard criteria. CCPD and 7,7-PD seem to have sufficient rubber performance in this test, but they are right around the aquatic toxicity threshold we set in our alternatives assessment hazard criteria. So we'll have to look closely at the studies to come to a conclusion on their hazard. With all these chemicals, we're missing some of the data we want to determine if we think they are safe or not. Usually this means that there has not been sufficient testing of ozonation products, which we want to confirm since we know the chemicals will react with ozone. This includes two new chemicals that are being advertised by manufacturers as potential replacements, SA6000 and Kumanox 19. Next slide. On this page is a list of some other chemicals that for the most part do not seem to have sufficient performance in our anti-ozonant testing. They were no better than having no anti-ozonant at all in the rubber testing. There's a published study showing carbon nanotubes have the potential to be a replacement, but we were unable to replicate their results. It's certainly possible that under different conditions, carbon nanotubes could be a viable replacement, however. Also listed are two of the new alternatives that have been advertised as replacements, one from Flexus and the amine functionalized graphene from Perpetuous, but we don't know anything about them, so as of now we can't come to any conclusion on their safety or feasibility. Next slide. In addition to chemical alternatives, some different methods of addressing the problem have been proposed, such as non-pneumatic tires or tire wear capture devices. However, since none of these are yet commercially available, we do not plan on evaluating them in this cycle. Next slide. In summary, we do not have sufficient data for any chemical and its transformation products to determine if they meet our criteria for safer. In addition, since no tires without 6-PPD are on the market, no alternatives are feasible and available. Therefore, we do not believe at this time we will have the information to support a restriction this cycle, though a reporting requirement is possible and likely to help us learn more about the volume of 6-PPD used in tires in Washington. Next slide. We would love some feedback if you have any input on our work around tires and 6-PPD. In particular, if you have any additional resources or information or thoughts on how to handle feasibility and availability, that would be appreciated. Also, thoughts on how we should handle the hazard criteria, if we should make any changes to the standard safer products criteria by adopting some of the additional aquatic toxicity specifications we plan on using in our alternatives analysis. And lastly, on the costs and benefits of a reporting requirement, since it looks like we will not have enough information for a restriction. Thanks for listening, and I'll pass it off to Prajwal.
Thank you, Craig. Hello, everyone. My name is Prajwal Tuladhar, and I am a safer products chemist with the Washington State Department of Ecology. Today, I'm providing an update on the alternative analysis for PFAS in cookware. I will be turning my camera off for the duration of this presentation. Next slide, please. The priority chemical class for cookware is PFAS. The main types of PFAS chemicals used in cookware include fluoropolymers such as polytetrafluoroethylene, fluorinated ethylene propylene, and perfluoroalkoxyalkanes used as coatings on the cookware surfaces. PFAS chemicals such as hexafluoropropylene oxide dimer, also known as GenX, and perfluorobutane sulfonic acid, PFBS, are also used as processing aids in making these fluoropolymers. Fluoropolymers can also be used as additives in other types of coatings, such as ceramic coatings or peat coatings, to enhance nonstick properties. The key hazards associated with PFAS chemicals include systemic toxicity, reproductive toxicity, developmental toxicity, bioaccumulation, and persistence. Next slide, please. The priority product scope for cookware includes durable houseware items intended to contact food or beverages and used to prepare, dispense, or store food, foodstuffs, or beverages. Cookware and kitchen supplies do not include major appliances such as refrigerators and stoves. Cookware can be categorized into 4 types: stovetop cookware, which uses direct heat to cook food; bakeware, which uses indirect heat source to cook food; small domestic appliances that use some sort of plug-in power source; and kitchen utensils and servoware used to prep, serve, or store food. Some examples of cookware includes items such as pots and pans, baking molds, baking trays, bowls, rice cookers, skillets, electric grills, etc. Next slide, please. The nonstick function of PFAS in cookware was identified in our Cycle 1.5 Technical Determinations Report. In addition to that, we also used information we received from manufacturers through manufacturer order and other correspondences. Coating manufacturer websites also contain some generic information on the cookware coating chemistries. Information on the use of PFAS as additives and processing aids in food contact surfaces or cookware were available through some FDA, ITRC, and patent literature publications. We also use same or similar sources to identify alternative chemicals that provide the same nonstick function as PFAS. Information from product websites about the types of cookware sold, the types of coatings used, and chemicals they may contain through the California disclosures were helpful in some of our alternative analysis. Next slide, please. Information we received from the manufacturer orders have been very helpful in our process. The process is working, but it does take more time than we anticipated. In early 2025, we contacted 9 different manufacturers who sold their products in Washington with 6 months to respond. We asked them about the chemicals used in their cookware to impart nonstick function and also the types of cookware they sold. Manufacturers are generally very responsive, and all of them responded to our initial request. They provided us with information on the types of cookware they sold and the chemicals used in their products. However, the information we received were sometimes unclear, and we had to reach out for additional information. For example, some manufacturers reported only silicon dioxide as the nonstick chemical in their ceramic coatings, while others provided a formulation with a list of chemicals, but no clarification on the nonstick ingredient. Some manufacturers also requested their information to be treated as confidential, further extending the timeline. Manufacturers themselves face challenges with the orders due to not having the information we asked for. Cookware manufacturers usually do not make their own coatings and buy them from coating manufacturers, who may not disclose all the information. So when we asked for more information, they had to reach out to their supplier, which also further extended the timeline. As for the current status of orders, we are currently waiting for additional information from 2 different manufacturers. Next slide, please. The primary function of PFAS in cookware is to create a nonstick surface that makes it easy for the user to cook and clean. Carbon-fluorine bonds of the fluoropolymer creates a low-energy surface that is also chemically inert and unreactive, making it difficult for the food molecules to stick to it during the process of cooking. It also makes the surface hydrophobic and oleophobic, meaning the water and oil beads up on the surface instead of spreading. PFAS chemicals such as fluoroalkoxysilanes and PTFE have been used as additives in some early ceramic-coated cookware and PEEK-coated cookware to enhance nonstick properties. The PFAS chemicals such as Gen X and PFBS, used as processing aids, could end up as trace impurities in the final product. In some types of non-coated cookware, PFAS chemicals have no function because there is no requirement for a nonstick surface on a cookware. Even though the main function of PFAS in cookware is to make it nonstick, the main function of cookware itself is to cook, prep, or serve food. Nonstick function is an added feature that makes it easier for the user to cook and clean. Next slide, please. While evaluating chemical alternatives to PFAS in cookware, we only evaluated the chemicals that provide the same function as PFAS. The evaluation for chemical alternatives are based on the chemical providing nonstick function. We did not make a conclusion for safer, feasible, and available based on evaluation of other chemicals in formulations such as solvents, fillers, coloring agents, etc. We included silicon dioxide because some manufacturers reported it as providing nonstick function. Based on our understanding, silicon dioxide and methyl trimethoxysilane provides the basic building blocks for ceramic coatings, but they do not provide sufficient nonstick function on its own. Organic silicones are usually added to make the coatings nonstick. Silicones, when used in coatings and elastomers, may serve multiple functions. They can act as cross-linkers or processing aids while also providing the nonstick function. The list provides some non-confidential nonstick silicone alternatives reported by manufacturers. Based on our preliminary evaluation of these chemicals using existing Cyvera hazard assessments, they are likely to meet our minimum criteria for safer, but we still want to review these assessments in detail before making a final determination. I want to remind everyone again that this webinar is being recorded, and once it is uploaded, you can pause to review the information in the tables presented. Next slide, please. Polyether ketones and polyaryl ether ketones, also known as PEEK or PAEK coatings, are newer technologies used to make extremely hard, scratch-resistant surfaces for cookware. We are still evaluating this type of cookware because we found that it may still use other fluoropolymers or silicone additives to achieve nonstick properties. Plaslan or plasma-coated silicone is an emerging technology in cookware where hexadimethylsiloxane is polymerized directly onto the cookware surface using plasma-enhanced chemical vapor deposition system. While the manufacturer informed us in their communications that there are no residual monomers present in the final product, this siloxane precursor does not meet our criteria for safer. So we're still trying to evaluate this technology to get a better understanding. We are also still waiting on a complete evaluation for a silicone resin and a polysiloxane chemical along with multiple others for which we have a confidentiality agreement with the manufacturers. Next slide, please. Based on the information we received from the manufacturer orders, cookware alternative nonstick chemicals are feasible and available for all of the cookware categories listed on this slide. A major manufacturer reported feasible and available nonstick aluminum and stainless steel stovetop cookware, as well as some small domestic appliances with nonstick chemicals mentioned in this slide. Another major manufacturer reported the hydroxy-terminated PDMS as a nonstick chemical on their cookware with ceramic coatings. Other manufacturers with confidential agreements reported feasible and available pots, pans, skillet, bakeware, baking sheets, rice cooker, and a small selection of small domestic appliances that use alternative nonstick chemicals in their coatings. Next slide, please. Cookware also has a lot of material alternatives that are available in the market. Some of the material alternatives we evaluated include cast iron and carbon steel. Since they are both alloys of iron and carbon, we looked at the hazard profile for iron and carbon, which meet our minimum criteria for safer. In addition to that, cast iron usually has a thermally oxidized layer of magnetite, also known as black iron oxide. We also looked into its hazard profile, which meets our minimum criteria for safer. Both cast iron and carbon steel can achieve nonstick properties through seasoning with cooking oils of soybean or corn. We have found manufacturers of cast iron and carbon steel products that pre-season with soybean oil or corn oil. These oils also meet our minimum criteria for safer. Titanium no-coat pans use a laser etching technology on a titanium surface that achieves nonstick function through the lotus effect, but these require a small amount of oil or butter. Titanium metal meets our minimum criteria for safer. Stainless steel is another material alternative that have different grades used in the market to make cookware. While not inherently nonstick, stainless steel can also be made to behave like a nonstick via the light and frost effect. This requires maintaining the correct temperature and using cooking oils or butter. We are still evaluating different grades of stainless steel, but current information indicates they meet our minimum criteria for safer. We have also found manufacturers of unglazed ceramic clay cookware that claim that their cookware is made from 100% pure primary clay and no glaze, which makes it less likely to contain any harmful chemicals. We are looking into learning more about this type of cookware as a material alternative. Next slide, please. Cookware made of alternative materials are feasible and available in the market. Major manufacturers of cast iron cookware make cast iron stovetop cookwares like pans, griddles, and skillets that can also be placed in the oven and acts as a hybrid bakeware. Stovetop cookware made of nitrided carbon steel, such as frying pans and woks, are already readily available. No coating nonstick titanium pans are heavily advertised as alternatives to PFAS-based cookware. Almost all major manufacturers of cookware make stovetop and bakeware products made of stainless steel. Small domestic appliances that feature stainless steel on food contact surfaces are available, maybe a little bit more expensive. However, stainless steel griddles are commonly found in commercial kitchens. Handcrafted, unglazed ceramic cookware that can be used as stovetop cookware, bakeware, and kitchen utensils are also readily available. Next slide, please. Kitchen utensils include items such as spatulas, tongs, knives, rolling pins, ice cream scoops, serverware, etc. PFAS chemicals or coatings are rarely used on these type of items to make it nonstick. Many kitchen utensils are not nonstick, and this function is not necessary. We believe that an alternative analysis is not required. Material alternatives such as stainless steel, cast iron, wood, stone, glass, ceramic, etc. are readily available for kitchen utensils. Next slide, please. Based on the current information, chemical alternatives are very likely to meet our minimum criteria for safer, and many material alternatives already meet our minimum criteria for safer. Both chemical and material alternatives cookware are available and feasible. While we are still evaluating some additional chemicals and material alternatives for safer, based on the current available information, it is very likely that we will propose a restriction for PFAS in cookware. Next slide, please. To wrap up our update, we would like to ask if there are any additional considerations for feasibility and availability that we should know or think about. You can send us any suggestions for additional resources or information that we should consider to the email address listed on the slide. Thank you all for your time. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to Wayne.